John Anderson had always been the kind of guy who liked his peace and quiet. He wasn't one for big cities or crowded places, no. He preferred wide open spaces where the air smelled clean, and you could hear nothing but the rustle of leaves and the occasional moo from his cattle. His ranch was more than just a piece of land. It was his sanctuary. It had everything he needed: rolling hills, sturdy fences, and enough room to do what he loved most: shooting targets. You see, John wasn't your average farmer. Before settling down on the ranch, he'd spent years serving in the military. Those days taught him discipline, patience, and how to handle firearms responsibly. Even after retiring, guns remained a big part of his life, not because he was some trigger-happy cowboy, but because shooting helped him stay sharp. It was like meditation for him, a way to clear his mind and focus on something simple yet challenging. And since his ranch was miles away from any neighbors, there was never anyone around to complain about the sound of gunshots echoing through the valley. But all that changed when developers showed up. They bought huge chunks of land nearby and started building houses, dozens of them. Soon, a whole new neighborhood sprouted up practically overnight. They called it Serenity Hills, which seemed ironic given how much trouble it would bring later. At first, John didn't think much of it. After all, his ranch was far enough away that he figured these newcomers wouldn't even notice him. But boy, was he wrong. The people moving into Serenity Hills weren't exactly the laid-back type. Oh no, they came with rules, lots of them. The Homeowners Association, HOA, ran things with an iron fist, dictating everything from what color people could paint their front doors to how loud they could play music. These folks were sticklers for order, and anything out of place set them off. So naturally, when they started hearing the occasional pop of gunfire from John's direction, they weren't thrilled. At first, it was just little things. A few residents mentioned to the HOA board that they found the noise unsettling. One lady claimed she couldn't relax by her pool because every time she heard a shot, she thought someone was breaking into her house. Another guy complained that the sound scared his dog. None of this made sense to John. For starters, he only shot during daylight hours and always followed strict safety protocols. Plus, his property was miles away from theirs. How could anyone possibly feel threatened? Still, the complaints kept coming. That's when John noticed something strange. One afternoon, while setting up targets near the edge of his land, he spotted a car parked along the dirt road that bordered his property. Inside was a man with a clipboard, staring at him through binoculars. When John waved, the man quickly lowered the binoculars and drove off without saying a word. Later, John learned that the guy worked for the HOA and had been sent to investigate his activities. That moment stuck with John. Something about the way the man looked at him felt off. Like he wasn't just curious, he was judging. And John knew better than anyone that judgment often led to trouble. Sure enough, it wasn't long before the HOA started making moves. Flyers appeared around Serenity Hills warning residents about the dangerous behavior happening nearby. Anonymous tips were sent to local authorities claiming John was reckless and putting lives at risk. For John, it felt like a slap in the face. Here he was, minding his own business, doing something perfectly legal, and suddenly he was being painted as some kind of outlaw. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just a bunch of city folks overreacting. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Little did he realize just how far the HOA would go to shut him down, or how far he'd be willing to go to fight back. The calm of John's mornings was shattered one day when he stepped outside to find flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the walls of his barn. 2 police officers stood by their patrol car, looking serious as they approached him. At first, John thought maybe someone had broken into one of the empty houses in Serenity Hills, or there was some kind of emergency nearby. But no, this visit was for him. "Morning, sir," one of the officers said, tipping his hat. "We got a call about gunfire coming from your property. Mind explaining what's going on?" John sighed. He'd been expecting something like this ever since those flyers started popping up around the neighborhood. Still, he wasn't worried. He had done nothing wrong. Calmly, he walked the officers over to where he kept his firearms and showed them his permits. He explained how he followed every rule, made sure his targets were set up safely, and even used earthen berms to stop stray bullets from traveling too far. "We're not saying you're doing anything illegal," the second officer chimed in. "But the HOA says the noise is bothering folks. We're just asking you to tone it down a bit." That line hit John like a punch to the gut. Tone it down? These people were miles away. How could they possibly be bothered by something so harmless? He bit back his frustration and nodded politely, promising to keep things quieter. But inside he was fuming. This wasn't about noise, it was about control. The HOA wanted him to bend to their will, and that was something John wasn't willing to do. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. The HOA ramped up their campaign against him, posting more flyers around Serenity Hills and sending letters to local officials demanding action. Some residents began driving past his ranch at odd hours, glaring at him through their windshields. Others muttered insults whenever they saw him in town. It felt like the whole world was ganging up on him, and for what? Just because he enjoyed shooting targets on his own land? Fed up, John decided to take matters into his own hands. He filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff's office, laying out all the facts. His permits were valid, his activities were safe, and the HOA had no legal grounds to harass him. For a while, it seemed like the issue might blow over. The sheriff agreed that John was within his rights and told the HOA to back off. But instead of letting it go, the HOA doubled down. Their leader, a stern woman who always wore perfectly pressed blazers, called a town hall meeting to address the ongoing safety concerns caused by John's activities. She invited everyone from Serenity Hills, including John himself, to attend. Reluctantly, he showed up, figuring it was better to face them head-on than let rumors spread unchecked. The meeting room buzzed with tension as John walked in. Dozens of eyes turned to stare at him, some curious, others hostile. The HOA leader stood at the front, tapping her pen against a clipboard as she waited for everyone to settle down. When she finally spoke, her voice dripped with disdain. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we've gathered here today to discuss a very serious matter. One of our neighbors has chosen to engage in reckless behavior that puts us all at risk. Gunfire near residential areas is not only disruptive but dangerous. We cannot tolerate this kind of irresponsibility." John clenched his fists under the table but forced himself to stay calm. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up and looked around the room. Most of the faces staring back at him were unfamiliar people who had never introduced themselves, never tried to understand his side of things. "I'm not here to argue," he said firmly. "I have every right to use my land however I see fit, as long as I'm following the law. And I am. I've taken every precaution to make sure my activities are safe. If anyone here has real concerns, I'm happy to listen. But if this is just about making me look like the bad guy, then we're wasting our time." His words didn't sit well with the crowd. A few people clapped half-heartedly, but most just glared at him. The HOA leader smirked, clearly pleased with herself. "You'll regret picking this fight," she said coldly before wrapping up the meeting. As John drove home that night, her words stuck in his mind. Regret? No, he didn't think so. What he felt was determination. He realized now that this wasn't just about him, it was about standing up for his rights. If the HOA wanted a fight, fine, he'd give them one. But it wouldn't be on their terms. Oh no, John had a plan brewing in his head, and once he put it into motion, the HOA would never see it coming. John wasn't the type to sit back and let people push him around. He'd spent years in situations where standing your ground was the only way to survive, and this was no different. Sure, he could have thrown in the towel, stopped shooting on his land, and let the HOA win, but that wasn't who he was. Instead, he decided to fight fire with fire, and in true John fashion, he came up with a plan so bold it would leave the HOA scratching their heads. The first thing John did was dig into the history of his property. He remembered something his late father used to say, "Know your land like you know yourself." So he dusted off old maps, deeds, and survey records, poring over them late into the night. What he found shocked even him. A small strip of wooded land along the edge of Serenity Hills, land the HOA had been using for hiking trails and picnics, technically belonged to him. It turned out there had been a mistake during the original subdivision process decades ago, and the error had never been corrected. Legally, that patch of trees and dirt was part of his ranch. At first, John wasn't sure what to do with this information. Then it hit him. Why not turn the tables? If the HOA was so obsessed with noise and safety, why not give them something to really talk about? He started clearing out the overgrown brush on the disputed land, leveling the ground, and setting up targets. Within weeks, he transformed the area into a proper shooting range. Not just any range. No, this one was state-of-the-art. He installed high-tech soundproof barriers made from recycled materials to minimize noise, built sturdy bullet traps to ensure stray rounds wouldn't go anywhere they shouldn't, and posted bright orange warning signs all over the place. When word got out about what John was doing, jaws dropped. Neighbors drove by just to see it for themselves, a fully functional shooting range right next to their precious hiking trails. Some were furious, others intrigued, but everyone had an opinion. John didn't care. He owned the land, followed every regulation to the letter, and operated well within his rights. For once, the HOA was powerless against the very man they'd tried to silence. To add insult to injury, John invited friends, fellow veterans, and local firearm enthusiasts to join him at the range. Word spread quickly, and soon people were coming from miles away to check it out. On weekends, you could hear laughter and friendly banter as groups gathered to practice their aim. The vibe was welcoming, almost festive. Kids played safely outside the range while parents swapped stories and shared tips. It wasn't long before John's shooting range became more than just a place to shoot. It was a community hub. Of course, the HOA didn't take this lying down. They flooded social media with angry posts, accusing John of being reckless and irresponsible. Flyers appeared around Serenity Hills again, warning residents to stay away from the dangerous zone. But here's the thing. John wasn't breaking any laws. In fact, he went above and beyond to make sure everything was safe. Anyone who visited the range saw that for themselves. Even some skeptical neighbors admitted privately that it looked far less threatening than they'd imagined. The HOA president was livid. She called emergency meetings, hired lawyers, and even threatened to sue John for harassment. None of it worked. Every attempt to challenge John's ownership of the land failed miserably. The truth was undeniable. The land was his, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Still, the HOA refused to back down. Desperate to regain control, they organized protests outside John's property. Dozens of residents showed up, holding signs that read things like "No guns near our homes" and "Protect our community." Some shouted insults, calling John selfish and dangerous. Others demanded he shut down the range immediately. Through it all, John stayed calm. He stood near the gate, arms crossed, watching silently as the crowd grew louder and angrier. Eventually, Curiosity got the better of some protesters. A few wandered closer, peeking through the fence to see what was really going on inside. That's when John made his move. With a grin, he walked over and unlocked the gate. "Come on in," he said, gesturing toward the range. "See for yourselves." Most hesitated, unsure whether to trust him. But a handful took him up on the offer. As they stepped inside, John gave them a tour, explaining how the soundproof barriers worked, showing them the bullet traps and pointing out the strict safety protocols he enforced. By the time they left, many were visibly impressed and a little embarrassed. One woman even apologized for assuming the worst about him. Not everyone changed their minds, of course. Plenty of residents remained hostile, determined to see John fail. But for the first time since the feud began, cracks started to form in the HOA's united front. And John knew exactly what that meant. The tide was turning in his favor. The story of John's shooting range quickly became the talk of the town, and not just in Serenity Hills. Local news crews caught wind of the feud and descended on the area like vultures circling a carcass. Reporters set up camp near the edge of John's property, shoving microphones in his face and firing off questions faster than he could answer them. "Is it true you turned an HOA hiking trail into a shooting range?" one asked. "How do you respond to claims that your activities are endangering residents?" demanded another. John handled the media circus with the same calm demeanor he brought to everything else. He didn't yell or get defensive. Instead, he spoke plainly, explaining his side of the story without sugarcoating anything. "Look," he told one reporter, "this is my land. I'm following the law, and I've taken every step to make sure people are safe. If anyone has real concerns, I'm happy to address them. But if this is just about bullying me into submission, then we're wasting our time." His words resonated with some viewers, especially those who valued personal freedom and property rights. Social media lit up with debates about whether John was a hero standing up to overbearing neighbors or a troublemaker stirring the pot. Supporters praised him as a symbol of resilience, while critics accused him of escalating the conflict unnecessarily. The headlines ranged from sympathetic "rancher fights back against overzealous HOA" to inflammatory "shooting range wars divide." Rural community. Amid all the chaos, life in Serenity Hills grew increasingly tense. Some residents stayed glued to their windows, convinced they'd hear gunfire at any moment, even though John strictly adhered to his weekday schedule. Others avoided going outside altogether, claiming they no longer felt safe. Meanwhile, the OA scrambled to regain control. They organized more protests, filed additional complaints with local authorities, and even reached out to state officials for help. Nothing worked. Every attempt to shut John down ended in failure. Then came the vandalism. One morning, John walked out to find his truck's tires slashed and ugly graffiti sprayed across the side of his barn. Words like "go away" and "bully" stared back at him in bright red paint. Whoever did it clearly wanted to send a message, but John wasn't intimidated. He snapped photos of the damage, reported it to the sheriff's office, and got to work cleaning up. By the end of the day, the graffiti was gone and the truck was patched up. Still, the incident left a sour taste in his mouth. It was one thing to disagree with someone. It was another to destroy their property. Determined to protect himself and his land, John installed security cameras around the perimeter of his property. He also hired a couple of retired friends, both former military, to patrol the area during peak hours. Their presence sent a clear message. Messing with John wouldn't be easy. The HOA president tried to spin the move as proof that John was paranoid and aggressive, but most folks saw it for what it really was, a reasonable response to outright hostility. As the weeks dragged on, the tension between John and the HOA reached a boiling point. Both sides dug in their heels, refusing to budge. Residents of Serenity Hills found themselves caught in the middle, torn between supporting their neighborhood association and sympathizing with the man being painted as a villain. Some started questioning whether the HOA had gone too far. After all, John wasn't hurting anyone. He was simply exercising his rights. Was it really worth all this drama? Even within the HOA, cracks began to form. A few members quietly expressed doubts about the direction things were heading. One elderly woman admitted she'd never heard a single gunshot from her house, despite living closest to John's ranch. Another homeowner confessed he admired John's determination to stand his ground. These whispers of dissent infuriated the HOA president, who doubled down on her efforts to vilify John. She held yet another emergency meeting, urging residents to stay united. "We can't let him win," she declared, slamming her fist on the table for emphasis. "If we give in now, what's next? What other rules will he break?" But unity was harder to maintain than she realized. As the standoff dragged on, fatigue set in. People grew tired of the constant arguing, the endless meetings, and the mounting legal fees. Even some of the harshest critics started to wonder if maybe they'd misjudged John. Perhaps he wasn't the reckless outlaw they'd made him out to be. Maybe he was just a guy trying to live his life in peace. And then, out of nowhere, a lifeline appeared. An unlikely mediator stepped forward, a retired judge who lived in Serenity Hills. Known for her fairness and sharp mind, she'd watched the feud unfold with growing concern. To her, it seemed like both sides were digging themselves deeper into a hole, neither willing to extend an olive branch. So, she decided to intervene. The judge arranged separate meetings with John and the HOA board, listening patiently as each side aired their grievances. She didn't take sides or pass judgment. Instead, she focused on finding common ground. Slowly but surely, she helped them identify areas where compromise might be possible. It wasn't easy. There were moments when tempers flared and negotiations nearly fell apart, but eventually, they reached an agreement. Under the terms of the deal, John agreed to limit his shooting range hours to weekdays only and implement additional noise reduction measures. In return, the HOA dropped all legal challenges and publicly acknowledged his right to use his land as he saw fit. Both sides walked away feeling like they'd gained something and lost something. For John, it meant giving up a bit of flexibility. For the HOA, it meant swallowing their pride and admitting they couldn't control him completely. When the dust finally settled, the atmosphere in Serenity Hills began to shift. The protests stopped, the angry posts disappeared from social media, and life slowly returned to normal. John continued running his shooting range, which ironically became a popular attraction for tourists and firearm enthusiasts alike. Families visiting from nearby towns would stop by to watch skilled marksmen hit targets, snapping photos and asking questions. Local businesses benefited too, as visitors spent money at diners, gas stations, and shops. For the Hoonebers, the resolution brought a sense of relief. While not everyone warmed up to John overnight, many came to appreciate his commitment to safety and responsibility. Over time, fences, both literal and metaphorical, began to mend. And though the memory of the feud lingered, it served as a reminder of how far people could come when they chose dialogue over division. John often reflected on those chaotic months, shaking his head at how quickly things had spiraled out of control. But he also felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because he'd won, but because he'd stood firm in his beliefs and refused to let fear dictate his actions. In the end, he proved that sometimes the best way to fight back isn't with anger or aggression. It's with patience, creativity, and an unshakable belief in doing what's right. The agreement between John and the HOA marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for everyone involved. At first, it felt strange, almost surreal. For months, the air had been thick with tension, every interaction laced with hostility. Now, there was a fragile peace, like the calm after a storm. People weren't exactly throwing block parties or inviting each other over for barbecues, but the constant bickering stopped. Slowly, life began to return to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could get after such a heated feud. John kept his end of the bargain, sticking strictly to the agreed-upon shooting range hours. On weekdays, you'd hear the occasional pop of gunfire echoing through the hills, but it was nothing compared to the chaos of before. He also went above and beyond to implement additional noise reduction measures. He installed thicker soundproof barriers around the range and experimented with quieter ammunition options. It wasn't cheap, and it took time, but John knew it was worth it. Every small step he took toward compromise showed the community that he wasn't just some stubborn rancher refusing to play by the rules. He was someone who cared about finding solutions. On their side, the HOA made good on their promise, too. They dropped all legal challenges and issued a public statement acknowledging John's right to use his land responsibly. It wasn't an apology, far from it, but it was a start. The president of the HOA, who had once led the charge against John, seemed to soften a bit. She didn't exactly become his biggest fan, but she stopped showing up at meetings ranting about the dangerous neighbor. Instead, she focused on other issues like improving streetlights and organizing community events. Some residents joked that she looked relieved to have the whole mess behind her, but not everyone forgot so easily. A handful of neighbors still harbored hard feelings, convinced that John had crossed a line he shouldn't have. They avoided him whenever possible and whispered complaints to anyone who would listen. One man even put up a tall fence along his property line, as if trying to block out the reminder of what had happened. John noticed these lingering resentments, but he didn't let them bother him. He figured that healing takes time and forcing. Forgiveness wasn't going to help anyone move forward. What surprised John most, though, was how many people actually came around. Over time, curiosity got the better of some residents. They started visiting the shooting range either because they were genuinely interested in firearms or simply wanted to see what all the fuss was about. At first, they came cautiously, parking their cars far away and keeping their distance. But once they stepped inside, they were usually impressed by what they saw. The range was clean, well-maintained, and designed with safety in mind. Volunteers greeted visitors warmly, explaining how everything worked and answering questions patiently. One Saturday morning, a young father brought his 2 kids to check out the range. The kids were wide-eyed as they watched experienced shooters hit targets with pinpoint accuracy. Their dad hung back, clearly unsure about whether this was the kind of place he wanted his family near. John spotted them and walked over, introducing himself and offering to show them around. By the end of the tour, the dad was smiling, shaking John's hand and thanking him for taking the time to explain things. "I thought this place would be, I don't know, scarier," he admitted. "But it's actually pretty cool." Moments like that meant more to John than he let on. Sure, winning arguments and standing your ground felt good, but connecting with people, that was different. It reminded him why he'd fought so hard in the first place. This wasn't just about protecting his rights. It was about proving that respect goes both ways. If you treat people fairly and give them a chance to understand where you're coming from, they might surprise you. As word spread about the range, it started attracting visitors from outside Serenity Hills. Tourists passing through the area would stop by, curious to see the infamous HOA versus rancher battleground turned shooting range. Some were firearm enthusiasts eager to test their skills, while others were families looking for something unique to do. Local businesses benefited from the influx of visitors, with diners filling up during lunch hours and gas stations seeing more traffic than usual. Even the HOA couldn't deny that John's range had become a boon for the community, even if they didn't say it out loud. Still, old wounds don't heal overnight. There were moments when tensions flared again, usually sparked by misunderstandings or lingering grudges. Once, someone reported hearing gunfire late on a Friday evening, claiming John had broken the rules. When authorities investigated, it turned out to be a false alarm, just a distant echo from another property miles away. Another time, a group of protesters showed up unannounced, holding signs and shouting slogans. But these incidents became fewer and farther between, fading into the background as life moved on. Years later, when the dust had fully settled, John found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. Sitting on his porch one evening, sipping coffee and watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized how much he'd grown through the experience. He'd always been a fighter, someone who stood his ground no matter what. But this feud taught him something new. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't won with force or anger. They're won with patience, creativity, and a willingness to listen. He also learned that people are complicated. Not everyone sees the world the same way, and that's okay. Some of his neighbors would never fully trust him, and that was fine. Others had surprised him with their kindness and openness, becoming unexpected allies. Through it all, he discovered that communities are built not by avoiding conflict, but by working through it together. Serenity Hills wasn't perfect, it never would be. But it was stronger because of what they'd been through. The feud had forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and each other. And while it hadn't ended in hugs and handshakes, it had created a foundation for something better: mutual respect. John smiled to himself as he finished his coffee. He'd come a long way since those early days of flashing police lights and angry protests. His ranch was still his sanctuary, but now it was more than that. It was a place where people gathered, laughed, and shared stories. And as far as he was concerned, that was the best outcome anyone could hope for.